Mountain men were basically wilderness alchemists. They turned flour, water, and thin mountain air into bread that rose without a single grain of yeast. No packets, no store, no civilization for hundreds of miles. Sounds impossible. It happened every single day in remote camps across the Rocky Mountains for over 50 years. The secret ingredient wasn't magic. It was bacteria. Wild bacteria floating in the air, living on their hands, hiding in their unwashed wooden bowls. When a trapper mixed flour and water and left it sitting by the campfire overnight, those invisible creatures crawled in and got to work. That crusty, sour bread they pulled from a cast iron skillet wasn't just edible. It was better for the human gut than almost anything you can buy in a grocery store today. This is the story of how it was made. From a handful of flour to a loaf that kept fur trappers alive in the harshest conditions on Earth. Let's start with what a mountain man actually had to work with, because it wasn't much. A fur trapper heading into the Rockies in the 1820s or 1830s carried maybe 50 pounds of flour in a canvas sack strapped to a mule. That flour had to last months, sometimes an entire trapping season from September through May. The flour itself was nothing fancy. Rough ground wheat or sometimes corn. No bleaching, no enrichment, no added vitamins. Just grain smashed between stones until it turned into powder. If you opened that sack today, you'd see flecks of bran, bits of germ, maybe a weevil or two crawling around. By modern standards, it looked dirty. By nutritional standards, it was far more complete than the white powder sitting in your pantry right now. Here's where things get interesting. This flour still had the wheat germ intact, the part modern mills strip out because it contains oils that go rancid on store shelves. But that germ is also where most of the vitamins live. Vitamin E, B vitamins, iron. The mountain man's flour was a whole food. Yours is a ghost of one. The trapper also carried salt, maybe a pound or two, and he had water from whatever stream or river he was camped near. That's the entire ingredient list: flour, water, and salt. And nobody talks about the smell. After weeks on a pack mule, that flour picked up the scent of leather, sweat, and pine sap. Open that sack and you'd get hit with something earthy and sharp. Not appetizing by any stretch. But that flour was about to undergo a transformation that would turn it into the most important meal in the wilderness. The problem was simple. Flour and water make paste, not bread. Without something to make the dough rise, you're eating flat, dense crackers. And in freezing mountain camps above 8,000 feet, where the air is thin and the temperature drops to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, getting bread to rise seems flat out impossible. But mountain men figured it out. The solution was already sitting in the air around them. Here's where things get wild. To make bread rise, you need gas. Tiny bubbles of carbon dioxide trapped inside the dough that push it upward and make it light and airy. Modern bakers use commercial yeast for this. Rip open a packet, dump it in, and the yeast eats sugar and burps out gas in an hour. Mountain men didn't have packets, stores, or anything except flour, water, and whatever was floating around in the mountain air. So they built a bacteria trap. A trapper would take a small wooden bowl or a tin cup, mix in a handful of flour and enough water to make a thin, runny paste, and then just leave it. Set it near the campfire where it stayed warm. Maybe tuck it inside his bedroll at night so his body heat kept it alive. Then he'd wait. For 2 to 3 days, nothing visible happened. The paste just sat there looking like watery glue. But invisible things were already moving in. Wild yeast spores floating through the mountain air. Lactobacillus bacteria living on the trapper's hands. microorganisms from the wooden bowl itself. All of them landing in that paste and starting to eat. By day 3 or 4, the paste started to bubble. Small bubbles at first, then bigger ones. The surface would get frothy. The smell changed completely. That flat, paste-like nothing turned sour and tangy, almost like vinegar mixed with beer. That smell meant it was alive. What the trapper had created, without knowing a single word of microbiology, was a sourdough starter. A living colony of wild yeast and bacteria working together. The yeast produced carbon dioxide to make bread rise. The bacteria produced lactic acid and acetic acid, which gave the bread its sour taste and, here's the part that matters, made it last longer and digest easier. If you're learning something from this, hit that like button and subscribe. Now, here's the genius move. Once a mountain man had a living starter, he never let it die. After making bread, he'd leave a glob of raw dough stuck to the inside of his bowl or his flour sack. That glob was loaded with billions of living bacteria and yeast. Next time he wanted bread, he'd just add flour and water to that old glob. The colony would wake up and start eating again. Some trappers kept the same starter alive for decades. They called this leftover glob the old dough, or the sponge, and guarded it like it was worth more than beaver pelts. Because in the wilderness, it was. Lose your starter, and you're eating flat, dense flour paste until you can grow a new one. At 10,000 feet in January, that could take a week you didn't have. Now we know what the starter was. But making actual bread from it in the middle of nowhere is where the real skill came in. Every step had a reason behind it that modern science didn't fully understand until the 1900s. The trapper would take his starter, that bubbly, sour glob, and mix it into a bigger batch of flour and water. Enough for a meal. He'd add a pinch of salt, maybe a spoonful of rendered bear fat or buffalo grease if he had it. The fat wasn't just for flavor. It kept the bread moist and added calories. A tablespoon of bear fat packed around 120 calories. In the mountains, calories meant survival. Then he'd knead it, not on a clean marble counter, on a flat rock, a log, or a piece of leather spread across his lap. His hands carried bacteria from skinning animals, handling traps, and weeks without soap. Those bacteria joined the party in the dough. Now, this is where it gets really fascinating. The dough had to ferment, and fermentation needs warmth. In a kitchen, you just leave it on the counter. But at a mountain camp, where nighttime temperatures dropped below zero, warmth was a serious problem. So trappers got creative. Some wrapped the dough in cloth and tucked it inside their shirts, letting body heat do the work. Others buried the dough near the campfire in a shallow hole, covering it with warm ashes. The famous mountain man, Jim Bridger, reportedly kept his dough ball inside his sleeping roll at night, fermenting bread with his own body heat while he slept. The fermentation took anywhere from 8 to 14 hours, depending on temperature. Warmer conditions meant faster rising. Cold meant slower. But here's what nobody tells you. Slower was actually better. Researchers at the University of Alberta found that longer fermentation times, 12 hours or more, allow lactobacillus bacteria to break down significantly more phytic acid in wheat flour. Phytic acid locks up minerals like iron, zinc, and magnesium, so your body can't absorb them. The bacteria chew through it during slow fermentation, literally unlocking the nutrition inside the grain. Mountain Man bread, fermenting slowly through a cold night, was doing exactly this. The cold didn't ruin the bread. It made it more nutritious. The bacteria were also producing organic acids, lactic acid and acetic acid, that dropped the pH of the dough to around 4.0 to 4.5. That's acidic enough to kill most harmful bacteria. The bread was preserving itself while it rose. A study from the University of Guelph showed that naturally fermented sourdough resists mold growth for up to 7 days longer than bread made with commercial yeast. The organic acids create an environment where mold spores can't get a foothold. So the mountain man's bread rose slower, digested better, delivered more nutrients, and lasted longer. All because he didn't have access to a packet of instant yeast. The limitation was the advantage. After a long night of fermentation, the dough was puffy, sour-smelling, and ready. Now came the moment that separated a good camp cook from a bad one: baking bread without an oven. The most common method was the cast iron skillet. A mountain man's skillet weighed about 8 pounds and served as frying pan, plate, and bread oven all in one. He'd grease the inside with animal fat, press the dough flat into a round about 1.5 inches thick, and set it over the fire. But fire is not an oven. Fire cooks from one direction. An oven surrounds food with even heat. Set your skillet directly in the flames, and the bottom burns black while the top stays raw dough. Mountain men solved this with a technique so clever it's still used by backcountry cooks today. They'd prop the skillet at an angle next to the fire, tilted toward the flames, so radiant heat hit the top of the bread while coals underneath cooked the bottom. Some built small walls of rocks around the skillet to reflect heat back. Others flipped the bread halfway through, cooking each side for about 15 to 20 minutes. But the real masters used the Dutch oven method. Trappers who could afford the extra weight, 12 to 15 pounds of cast iron, carried a Dutch oven into the mountains. A heavy pot with a flanged lid designed to hold hot coals on top. The process went like this: scrape a bed of glowing coals from the fire. Set the Dutch oven on top. Place the dough inside. Put the lid on. Shovel more hot coals on top of the lid. Heat from below. Heat from above. The bread baked surrounded by radiant energy from every direction. And here's the part that sounds impossible until you try it. A skilled camp cook could judge the temperature inside that Dutch oven by holding his hand near the lid. 5 seconds meant about 350 degrees Fahrenheit. Perfect bread temperature. 3 seconds meant closer to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. 1 second meant pull the coals off immediately, or you're eating charcoal. No thermometer. No timer. Just a calloused hand and years of experience. The baking took 25 to 40 minutes. Too much heat and the outside turned to crust while the inside stayed gummy. Too little and the bread never set, giving you a dense, wet lump that sat in your stomach like a stone. Get it wrong, and you wasted flour you couldn't replace for months. When it worked, and experienced trappers got it right almost every time, the result was a round, golden brown loaf with a thick, crunchy crust and a sour, chewy inside. Dense by modern standards, maybe 2 inches tall, but warm, filling and packed with slow-release energy from the whole grain flour and long fermentation. The crust itself was important. That hard outer shell wasn't just texture, it was a natural seal that kept moisture in and bacteria out. A well-baked loaf could last 5 to 7 days in a saddlebag without molding. In cold weather, even longer. Some trappers reported bread lasting 2 weeks in winter camps. A mountain man didn't know any of this science. He just knew the bread kept him alive and kept his stomach working when nothing else would. But here's what modern researchers have figured out about what was actually happening inside that sourdough. The wild lactobacillus bacteria, the same ones that made the bread sour, were producing compounds called exopolysaccharides, a type of natural fiber that feeds the good bacteria already living in your gut. Researchers at the Italian National Research Council found that sourdough bread made with wild lactobacillus strains contained significantly higher levels of these prebiotic compounds than bread made with commercial yeast. The mountain man was eating a prebiotic every single meal without trying. Those same bacteria were also breaking down gluten proteins during the long fermentation. Not destroying gluten entirely, but chopping the long, tough protein chains into shorter pieces that your stomach can actually handle. A team at the University of Bari in Italy tested traditionally fermented sourdough and found that after 24 hours of bacterial fermentation, the gluten content dropped dramatically, enough that some people with mild gluten sensitivity could eat it without symptoms. The mountain man's bread was pre-digested. The bacteria did the hard work before it ever hit his stomach. And then there's mineral absorption. In a modern loaf made with instant yeast in 45 minutes, most of the phytic acid is still intact. Your body gets the calories but misses the minerals. In a sourdough fermented for 12 hours or more, the bacteria break down 60 to 70% of the phytic acid. The minerals are unlocked. Your body absorbs them. A fur trapper eating this bread 3 times a day was getting iron, zinc, and magnesium that a modern person eating store-bought bread simply doesn't get, even if the flour looks the same on paper. The slow fermentation wasn't a limitation. It was a biological upgrade the mountain man stumbled into because he had no other choice. And here's one more thing nobody talks about. The wild bacteria strains in mountain sourdough were local. Every river valley, every mountain range had slightly different microorganisms floating in the air. A starter created in the Wind River Range tasted different from one started in the Bitterroots. Trappers at the annual rendezvous gathering, where thousands of mountain men met to trade, would compare bread the way people today compare barbecue. Whose starter was older? Whose was Tangier? Whose made the best rise? What started as a handful of rough flour and a cup of creek water became something extraordinary. Not through technology or factories, but through bacteria, patience, and a cast iron skillet over an open fire. A mountain man with no education, no kitchen, and no recipe book made bread that was more nutritious, longer lasting, and easier to digest than what rolls off industrial production lines today. Months of wilderness isolation. A living colony of bacteria passed from one batch to the next. Skills read by hand, by nose, by instinct. That's what went into every single loaf. From flour dust on a mule's back to golden bread in the shadow of the Rockies. Subscribe, and let's keep digging up their secrets.